Today we'll be talking about the story Do Not Go Gentle by Sherman Alexie. I think the theme that goes with this story is coping with trauma. The quote from the story was, "My wife and I didn't know Mr. Grief in person until our baby boy got his face stuck between his mattress and crib and suffocated himself blue. He was our little blue baby Jesus." This was the first time that these parents ever experienced something like this. It was the first time that they had come face to face with grief itself. And it was something hard to go through. They also said that this was their little blue baby Jesus, and that is why I chose this picture to represent this scene. He died 3 times that day, Mr. Grief squeezing his lungs tight, but the doctors and nurses battled that suffocating monster man and brought our boy back to life 3 times. Now, the reason I chose this image was to represent man fighting death, man being the doctors and death is Mr. Grief. Mr. Grief is described as a monster man who is trying to take their baby away from them, but the doctors fought hard and did everything they could to bring him back, pulling him from Mr. Grief and keeping him stable. I'm lying. Our baby wasn't Jesus. Our baby was alive only a little bit. Mostly he was dead and slept his way through a coma. Alexie uses the words "I'm lying" and brings the audience back to reality of what is really going on. I also chose this image to represent the baby being in a coma and one parent waiting by his side and grieving. Quote, I picked, "My wife is beautiful and powerful and only 25 years old, but she is magic like a grandmother, and Indian grandmothers aren't afraid of a little man like Mr. Grief." In this section, Mr. Grief is being described as a little man who these parents are not afraid of. The husband is portraying his wife as being as strong as a Native American grandmother, and she is not afraid of Mr. Grief taking her child away from her, and still has hopes of him recovering. 5th quote I chose, "While I guarded over our baby, my wife wrapped her braids in a purple bandana, shoved her hands into thick work clothes, sneaked up on Mr. Grief in the hallway and beat him severely about the head and shoulders like she was Muhammad Ali." I chose this picture of Muhammad Ali because he's shown fighting in this ring, but he looks mad, and that represents the way the wife is feeling in this situation. She is fighting Mr. Grief. She is put into a position where she doesn't know what to do, but all she can do is have hope. When you are hurting, it feels good to hurt somebody else, but you have to be careful. If you get addicted to the pain causing, then you start hurting people who don't need hurting. In this part of the story, the husband was afraid of what his wife was going to turn into. He mentions that he swore he saw Mr. Grief behind her eyes and did everything he could to get her back to her normal self. The image I chose represents someone that feels bad for something they've done. This relates back to the quote saying, "You start hurting people who don't need hurting. After that happens, you're full of regrets." Sitting on the bowl, pants wrapped around my ankles, I couldn't move. I was afraid and paralyzed by the deadly venom of the grief snake. Now, the snake in this image represents the pain the husband is feeling, like he is unable to move because of how badly he's hurting. But aside from the pain, he wanted to stand up and keep fighting for his son. 8. I picked, "A father with a sick child is an angry God." And for this, I chose an image of a god activating the lightning to strike down on the earth as an act of being angry. And as the husband describes it, he would have earthquaked Los Angeles, Paris, and Rome, or even killed a million innocent people if it meant he could bring his boy back to life. Basically, a father would punish the world if his child was dying. And maybe it was stupid and useless, but we all were sick and tired of waiting for our babies to die. And in the story, the husband says this after purchasing an erotic toy from an adult store. He purchases this because he doesn't know what else to do, using his hopeful energy to bring his son back. And I chose this image as a way of describing the parents hoping that their baby comes back and grows to live a wonderful life. And that's what the plant represents. And so my wife and I named him Abraham, and carried him home and laid him in his crib and hung chocolate thunder from the ceiling above him like a crazy mobile, and laughed with the joy of it. I chose this image because it shows a couple being happy together as they put their baby in the crib. These parents in the story were unbelievably happy that their baby got to come home. Although I am not familiar with the Bible or as to why they named the baby Abraham, but I'm sure there is a significance to it. Works cited pages. Page number 2. Thank you for watching.